Hello guys and welcome back to our channel. Now in today's video, my fellow black sisters are setting the record straight on the hidden truths of our history. Truths that have been suppressed and ignored. Now one sister boldly addresses the dangerous narrative that black people should forget the past and move on. But the past isn't something that can be forgotten easily because it's something we must remember. Now she brings to light the brutal realities of slavery, revealing the dark practices that were used to break, dehumanize, and destroy black people. Like the horrific seasoning process where slaves were beaten, starved, and mentally broken to ensure compliance. Now she speaks of the tea to the char, branding, and forced breeding used to turn human beings into property, and the unimaginable cruelty faced by black babies who were even used as alligator bait. Now another sister exposes the falsehoods about Jess Jackson and the creation of the term African American. Now this is an important conversation, one that demands to be heard, acknowledged, and understood. So with that said, tune in as they uncover the hidden truths of history that must never be forgotten. I will be right back.
I know a lot of white people want us to forget about the past. It's the past. It happened decades ago. It shouldn't matter anymore, but it truly does matter. I'm going to tell y'all some of the things that they did not tell you about things that happened in slavery. Seasoning. Yes, they seasoned us before they sold us off. Before slaves were sold off, they had to be seasoned. This meant beating, starving, and mentally breaking them down until they lost all hope of rebellion. Those who resisted were tortured in front of others. Many were branded like cattle, burned with hot iron to mark them as property. The goal was to erase their identity and to make them accept their new life as property. Grape and forced breeding. So literally turning black humans into livestock. Slave master would grape the black slave women. But get this, not just for cruelty, but for profit. Black women were forced to have babies so they could make more slaves. Some were sent to breed in plantations where they were raped repeatedly. Even young girls weren't spared. Many were raped as young as 12 years old. And a lot of people may question, okay, well, what about the mixed kids? Because, the slave owners raped the black women. They was treated just as the same. They were sold by their own fathers. If you came from a black person, it didn't matter. You still was black to them. That's why a lot of people will say that, white people hate mixed people more than anything. It was an abomination to them, and it still is. So just because you came from a white slave master, you didn't get spared. You were sold as well. Black women wasn't seen as humans. They were seen as profit, as tools, as a way to make money. Slave owners had punishment books, and these were records that was kept on how to torture a slave. So like the iron muzzle, I heard about that a lot. I read about that a lot, where they would put on a metal mask on a slave to stop them from speaking or eating. Any black man was, cut down in their little pee area. It was cut off as punishment or to stop rebellion. A whip with sharp metal tips, and this was used to rip a skin off a person's back. A neck collar with spikes. So if a slave was exhausted and tries to rest their head, hit them in the neck. Buried alive. Some people were put in boxes underground, just enough air to survive a few days. This is what kept slaves in constant fear. The pregnant women game. Slave owner would use pregnant women for entertainment. White men will bet on how far a pregnant woman could be beat until she pregnant women upside down and cutting their bellies open, forcing pregnant women to work until they miscarried. Many enslaved women went into labor while picking cotton. They were forced to give birth in the fields and to keep working. To them, a black woman's life meant nothing. Only the profit from their baby mattered. Let's talk about the medical experiments. I know y'all heard about the black women that were experimented on without anesthesia. I'm talking about while they're still awake. He cut them open, stitched them up, and then did it all over again. He claimed that black people didn't feel the same pain that white people do. Even today, black women is still going through the same thing in hospitals. Modern medicine was built on the suffering of black bodies. Destruction of black families. I see a lot of people always talk about black people this, black people that, when black people has went through hell and back, and then somehow we still come on top, and it still triggers people to this day. So I hear a lot of people talk about the dysfunction in black families, well, I want to tell you where it came from. Families was ripped apart on purpose. Slave owners would literally sell the children to break the mother's spirits. Husband and wives were separated to prevent deep emotional connections. They made the black men watch their wives be great. so they'll feel powerless. This is why families still struggle with deep generational trauma. Slavery just didn't destroy people, it destroyed bloodlines. Slavery really just never ended, it just changed forms. Mass incarceration replaced plantations. The war on targeted Black communities. Black women are still hyped and dehumanized in media. The only way that we can break these invisible metal chains to us, we must educate ourselves on real history. We must heal from generational trauma. We must reclaim our power, our identity, and our future. Because we're not their slaves anymore. We are their worst fear. Black people who know the truth.
So I hope y'all didn't think just because Black History Month was over, I was going to stop talking about dark history. No. Did you know white people used to use Black babies as alligator bait? Let's get into it. And before you come in my comments crashing out, these are facts. And if you get mad at me for telling them instead of getting mad it happened, it's a you problem, not mine. Don't make it mine in my comments. Let's get started. So yesterday I spent quite a bit of time doing some research and gathering some headlines of just this very thing, Black children being used as alligator bait. So this first article is from the Washington Times. It is a headline printed on June 3rd of 1908. And the article is entitled, "Zoo Specimens Coaxed to Summer Quarters by Plump Little Africans." The details are, the New York Zoological Garden zookeeper sent 2 Black children into an enclosure that housed more than 25 crocodiles and gators. The children were chased by the hungry reptiles and entertaining visitors while they led the reptiles into a different area of the enclosure. And of course, they succumbed to these animals. The zookeeper was never punished because this was seen as normal and even believed that the reptiles had an Epicurean fondness for the Black man. A 1923 Times Magazine article reported that, quote, colored babies were being used for alligator bait in Chipley, Florida. The babies were being placed to play at the water's edge, draw attention, and bring the animals out of the water, and then the hunters could proceed. Miami New Times reported that gator hunters would sit crying Black babies too young to walk to the water's edge. They put rope around their little necks and their little waists, and the babies would splash and cry until taken by an alligator. The hunters would wait until the gators had the babies in their mouths, and that's when they would execute the gator, literally trading a baby's life for an alligator skin. Now, it's my understanding that this practice, this brutality, had faded out by the 1920s because societal attitudes had changed and people were understanding, finally, for some reason, that you should not be using babies for alligator bait. Now, there are a lot of naysayers that, oh, this never happened, but how many times have we seen in American history that people deny what's on record because it makes them uncomfortable? Let me know what you guys think in the comments.
Jesse Jackson did not create the term African American. This is a common misconception. The earliest usage of the term that historians have found dates back to 1782. Historians believe that this was a free Black man in Philadelphia that wrote this sermon and called himself an African American. The term was also used in 1835 in an abolitionist publication. And Malcolm X used the term in the 1960s.
African Americans, who are so-called.
It was activist Ramona Edelin that moved the term African American into the mainstream and into academia. At the time, she was the head of the National Urban Coalition. She had met with Jesse Jackson, and he, among many other activists and scholars, held a press conference in which they supported using this term over the term simply Blacks because it helped to emphasize our cultural heritage, that we were more than just a color. But because he was a superstar, everyone credited him.
Did you know that white people actually bought a lot of enslaved Black people just to free them? Oh, so sweet, isn't it? It wasn't sweet, child. It actually helped create what we know to be Liberia. Side note, there was already people there. There is an indigenous population. We can't forget them because Black people think that we created Liberia when that's just not true. We, too, were immigrants. But about the white people buying Black people to sell them, this took place. There's an organization called the ACS, the American Colonization Society. Now, if you don't do extensive research, you'll find that it was created to promote the manumission of Black people, manumission meaning like freeing Black people with certificates, and that it was created to send Black people to Liberia. But in this series, I'm actually going to explain to you what it actually was. Now, the ACS was a group of slave owners and abolitionists. You heard that right. Business do they need to be in together? I don't know, but I also don't trust it. And I'm happy when I first heard it, I didn't, because it was a scam. It was. Now, they did end up sending some like 12,000 black people to Sierra Leone and Liberia, like freeing those people. But we're going to talk about it. We'll talk about it. Let's talk about it. This is going to be part 1 to part 2. If you're curious about what this is, I have a nonprofit dedicated to keeping Black history in schools. I'm starting a after-school program. It's going to be 2 hours taught by African American Studies majors students from the local HBCUs here in Atlanta. If you want to help me, what I need right now is people talking about it. Get people talking about it. If you can vote, please vote for me using my link tree, and donate if you can. You can buy this, just help me out. However you can, help me out. If you don't know how, DM me. I'll tell you. But yeah, did you know this?
Fake Black history, way too many people believe house slaves had better lives than field slaves. This is completely false. First of all, there was more to the slavery dichotomy than house versus field. In fact, there are some enslaved African Americans that didn't even work on plantations. They worked in the city, or they worked as blacksmiths or artisans. But getting back to enslaved African Americans that worked as house help, many of them endured terrible violence and abuse. So of course they fought back. And one weapon of choice was poison. Poison was used as revenge for intimate violence against enslaved women, used as revenge for all sorts of abuses. Let's take a look at what the Low Country Digital History Initiative says. Enslaved women also utilized their gender-specific roles to practice resistance. Women working in plantation houses as cooks, especially senior mammy figures, possessed the ability to poison through the food they cooked. To carry out these acts, women relied on the knowledge within their communities about dangerous roots and plants. So house slaves were actually fighters.
Now, what our fellow Black sisters are saying is absolutely vital, and this sheds light on some of the darkest yet most important aspects of Black history that is often overlooked or intentionally hidden. The sisters' words about the seasoning process is not just a harsh metaphor, but they reflect a reality that many people, especially outside of the Black community, have never fully understood. The seasoning of enslaved Africans was a brutal process meant to break their spirits and prepare them for a life of subjugation. And this included physical abuse, starvation, and psychological manipulation. Slaves were often punished for attempting to resist or escape, and their bodies and minds were systematically broken in order to force them into submission. And this wasn't just about controlling labor, it was about dehumanizing an entire race. Now, one of the most disturbing aspects she mentions is the widespread practice of branding, where enslaved people were literally branded with hot irons like livestock, marking them as property. Now, this was done not just for identification, but to strip them of their identities and any sense of autonomy. They were no longer seen as human beings, but as commodities to be bought and sold. Now, this was part of a broader effort to erase any connection to their past, their families, and their cultural identities. The goal was to strip them of everything that made them human, leaving them completely dependent on their captors. Now, the brutal practice of forced breeding, as she points out, is another example of how Black people were treated as livestock. Slave owners would often breed enslaved people like animals to increase their profits. Enslaved women particularly were subjected to horrific violence and forced pregnancies as part of this dehumanizing system. And these women were not just violated physically, they were also denied agency over their own bodies, with their very existence and reproduction commodified. Now, the story of Black babies being used as alligator bait is one of the most gruesome chapters of American history that often gets ignored. While it's difficult to imagine, historical accounts from former slaves and abolitionists confirm that this horrific practice did occur, particularly in the southern United States, where enslaved Black children were unallied for sport. It's a reminder of the extreme lengths to which palm-color supremacy was willing to go in order to maintain power and instill fear in the enslaved population. Now, when the sister mentions the myths surrounding Jesse Jackson and the term African American, she is pointing to a larger issue of how Black history and identity have often been distorted or misrepresented. The term African American was popularized in the late 20th century, but it wasn't a concept created by Jesse Jackson. In fact, the term was part of a larger movement to reclaim a sense of pride in Black identity and culture after centuries of oppression. However, the way such moments in history are portrayed can often be muddied or twisted, leading to misunderstandings of our true history, and the forces that shaped our present. Now, what these sisters are doing is incredibly important because they're challenging us to confront these painful truths and to understand how they continue to impact us today. And this history isn't just a set of old stories. It's the foundation of the social and racial inequalities that Black people still face. The brutality of the past must not be forgotten, and the continued erasure of these facts only perpetuates the cycles of injustice. Now, seasoning or the seasoning was the period of adjustment that slave traders and slaveholders subjected African slaves to following their arrival in the Americas. While modern scholarship has occasionally applied this term to the brief period of acclimatization undergone by European immigrants to the Americas, it most frequently and formally referred to the process undergone by enslaved people. Now, slave traders use the term seasoning to refer to the process of adjusting the enslaved Africans to the new climate, diet, geography, and ecology of the Americas. Now, the term applied to both the physical acclimatization of the enslaved person to the environment as well as that person's adjustment to a new social environment, labor regimen, and language. Slave traders and owners believed that if slaves survived this critical period of environmental seasoning, they were less likely to get unalived, and the psychological element would make them more easily controlled. Now, this process took place immediately after the arrival of enslaved people, during which their mortality rates were particularly high. These new or saltwater slaves were described as outlandish on arrival, and those who survived this process became seasoned and typically commanded a higher price in the market. For example, in 18th century Brazil, the price differential between new and seasoned slaves was about 15%. There was a slave brand recovered from Georgia which has an S-shaped head and a wooden handle. The head would be heated in a fire of furnace until burning hot, and then pressed into the skin of an enslaved person to create a permanent scar. The process was excruciating and often used as a form of corporal punishment. Now, branding was also used to prevent enslaved people from seeking freedom. A person with a visible brand marking them as a runaway would find it more difficult to make another escape, and their appearance would be a discouragement to others who might attempt to self-emancipate. Now, enslavers and companies who participated in the slave trade would often brand people with their company name or initials as a form of identification, the same way they would farm animals or tobacco barrels. Now, the blacks in America have been subjected to untold hardship during the slave era. Alligator hunters kidnapped black infants. These alligator hunters lured the larger alligators with human flesh and blood, skinned them alive or tied them and dropped them into a swamp. Crocodile trackers would sit crying black children who were too young to even think about walking at the water's edge, dangling them near the mouths of hungry pound alligators. These black babies were stolen, caged, and fed to alligators alive. Now, the trackers would unalive the gator simply after the infant was in its jaw, exchanging one kid's life for one croc's skin. Now, this book is really a sad tale of the inhumane treatment of black babies or toddlers of slaves used as bait or traps to alligators. It was reported that in the event that the baby survives, the mothers are being paid just $2 as compensation, and they're made postcards and pictures to remember the training. It reminds everyone to the offenses inflicted on black people and the artist cruelty at the time. Now, you can hear from my voice that I'm really hate. Like, I'm reading this for the first time, and this has really broken my heart. But the title of the book is Slaves, Babies, and the Alligator's Bit by Paul Gregory. I don't think if you're strong enough, you can read the book and just learn about the horrific things that were done to black people. And this is a history that Pamela to the Cis people want black people to just forget about it. It's the past. But this is something that cannot be forgotten, because you start to think about why such things were being done. How can people do such things to another human being? How can another human being do such a thing to another human being? Talk less of a baby. It's really sad. There are a lot of things that really happened during slavery. And yeah, we have finally come to the end of the video, but what do you our viewers have to say? Share your thoughts as well in the comment section. Thank you for watching and see you in our next video.